June 4th, 1942. The morning sky over the Pacific was a deceptive blue, the kind that promised calm, not carnage, but beneath it, the Battle of Midway was unfolding, and fate was quietly writing an unexpected footnote to the war in the air. Far to the north, near a lonely stretch of land called Akutan Island in the Aleutians, a Japanese fighter pilot named Tadayoshi Koga was limping home in his Mitsubishi A6M0. His aircraft, the pride of Japan's Imperial Navy, had been damaged during a raid. Smoke trailed from its belly as it drifted toward the island. He thought he could make an emergency landing on the soft bog below. He was wrong. The plane flipped, killing him instantly. But what no one knew that day was that his death and his intact aircraft would change the course of aerial combat in the Pacific. When American search planes later spotted the glint of the wreckage, they didn't yet realize what they'd found. On the ground, the Zero lay almost perfectly preserved, its smooth skin and slender wings barely scarred by the crash. It looked more like a sleeping predator than a corpse of war. The recovery team that arrived weeks later couldn't believe their luck. The Zero had been an enigma, a ghost that haunted every dogfight since Pearl Harbor. Pilots whispered about it like a myth. It could outturn, outclimb, and outrun nearly everything the Americans could put in the sky. Now, for the first time, they had one in their hands. One Navy officer supposedly muttered, half in awe, "It's like finding the enemy's playbook, gift-wrapped." At the time, American aviators were in a state of near desperation. The Wildcat, the F4F, was the Navy's main fighter, and though tough, it was hopelessly outclassed. In combat reports, pilots describe how the Zero could turn inside you, climb past you, and vanish before you could blink. Commander John S. Jimmy Thatch, one of the Navy's most respected tacticians, admitted later, "We had to fight the Zero with our wits, not with our wings." His solution, the Thatch Weave, was a defensive maneuver born of necessity, not superiority. America's confidence in its aircraft industry had been shaken. How could the world's most industrialized nation be losing the skies to an island empire? The Zero had become a symbol, elegant, untouchable, and utterly lethal. When the captured aircraft, soon dubbed the Akutan Zero, arrived at North Island Naval Air Station in San Diego, it was treated like a holy relic. Technicians and engineers crowded around it as if they were archaeologists brushing sand off a lost treasure. They noted its near weightless construction, aluminum so thin it flexed under a finger's touch. Its controls were delicate, almost artistic. The Zero was not armored. It relied instead on grace and agility. One engineer later wrote, "It was a ballerina, not a boxer. You hit it once and it broke, but good luck landing that hit." That discovery alone shifted thinking. For months, American pilots had believed the Zero's superiority came from secret technology. In truth, it came from simplicity, from a ruthless trade-off between protection and performance. The first test pilot to take the Akutan Zero into the air was Lieutenant Eddie Sanders. His job was to fly it, fight it, and find its weaknesses. "We now had the answer to the Zero," he said after first flight. "It was fragile and it lost its nerve in a dive." His tone was cool, almost analytical, but the implication was enormous. He and his team ran flight after flight, pushing the Zero until its limits became clear. In sharp dives, the controls stiffened, its wings shuddered, and recovery became sluggish. In tight turns, the aircraft responded beautifully, but any pilot who dared to follow it too long risked stalling. The mystery was gone. The myth had boundaries. Every discovery was cataloged in meticulous notes and sketches. Engineers measured its climb rate, recorded its stall speeds, and plotted how it bled energy in steep dives. The Zero's secret spilled out not under torture, one Navy report joked, but under a wrench. The sense of scientific satisfaction was almost gleeful. For the first time, America had data, not rumors. It wasn't magic that made the Zero deadly. It was design. And once you understood design, you could defeat it. Some mechanics began referring to the recovered plane with a hint of dark humor as Koga's Ghost. The name stuck. They felt a strange respect for the fallen pilot who, in death, had given them a weapon more powerful than any bullet. Understanding. At Grumman Aircraft Engineering on Long Island, Word of the captured Zero arrived like a jolt of caffeine. Roy Grumman, the company's founder, was already deep into designing a successor to the Wildcat. He was a practical man, more engineer than artist, but he understood war was as much about psychology as it was about machinery. Give the pilot armor, he reportedly said. Give him a plane that forgives mistakes. The data from the Akutan Zero flowed into his design rooms. Weight ratios, control sensitivities, weaknesses in high-speed maneuvers. Engineers pinned charts to walls, circled numbers, and argued about aerodynamics late into the night. The goal wasn't to copy the Zero. It was to beat it at its own game. Meanwhile, at test fields in California, Lieutenant Sanders continued to push the Zero's limits. He compared his performance against captured and prototype American aircraft. The reports were methodical, often dry, but between the lines lay quiet excitement. Its acceleration is poor above 200 knots. One read, unable to maintain control beyond 350 miles per hour. In modern terms, those lines meant survival. Pilots could dive to escape. They could rely on their engines to pull through. The terror that had once defined air combat in the Pacific began to fade. Knowledge, cold, rational, mathematical, had broken fear's spell. Still, there was irony in the whole affair. The Japanese Navy had built the Zero on principles of elegance and minimalism. The Americans, with their heavier hands and thicker steel, built planes that could crash on a carrier deck and still fly home. The contrast was philosophical as much as technological. They built for perfection, one American mechanic said. We built for forgiveness. It was, in a strange way, a metaphor for the nations themselves. By the autumn of 1942, engineers at Grumman were translating their newfound understanding into blueprints. They strengthened the fuselage, added armor plating around the cockpit, and chose the massive Pratt & Whitney R 2800 engine, a brute force solution to a finesse problem. The early prototype was christened the F6F Hellcat. The name alone carried intent. It wasn't meant to dance. It was meant to dominate. The Hellcat would climb faster, dive harder, and endure longer than anything before it. But before all of that, before the victories and the kill ratios, there was this single, silent moment. A Japanese plane resting in an Alaskan bog, its propeller half buried in mud, holding in its quiet frame the blueprint for its own undoing. To the engineers who studied it, the Akutan Zero was more than a capture machine. It was a revelation in aluminum. It taught them humility, that overconfidence had cost lives. It taught them patience, that true progress came from understanding, not anger. And it taught them irony, that sometimes the key to victory arrives not with trumpets, but with a faint sound of crash landing in the middle of nowhere. One officer later remarked, with dry humor, the Zero gave us the Hellcat. You could almost call it a joint project. When the Navy shipped the aircraft back to its base after months of tests, it was still treated with reverence. The technicians who had once stared at it with awe now saw it differently. Less as a marvel, more as a teacher whose lessons had been absorbed. In photographs from that period, the Zero stands alone on the tarmac, its paint faded, its insignia foreign and haunting. A caption beneath one image reads simply, Captured Enemy Aircraft, Akutan Island, 1942. It is a quiet image, almost melancholic. Few looking at it could have guessed that this single machine had already rewritten the future of aerial warfare. By the end of that year, reports from the tests reached every major U.S. fighter program. Designers adjusted wing angles, tuned engines, reinforced cockpits. Pilots were briefed on the Zero's weaknesses before heading into combat. The once invincible enemy now had vulnerabilities, and knowing them changed everything. In war, intelligence is power, and that power this time had been delivered by gravity itself, a fall that echoed across oceans. When Eddie Sanders climbed down from the Zero after his final test flight, he reportedly looked back at the sleek frame and said softly, "We understand you now." That phrase might have seemed simple, but in it lay the end of the Zero's mystique and the beginning of the Hellcat's reign. The tide of Pacific Air War was turning, and it started not with a battle, but with a crash, one forgotten moment that transformed weakness into wisdom. What came next would not only avenge the losses of the early war, but redefine what air superiority meant. The hunter had become the student, and the student was about to build something the hunter could never outrun. Early 1943, the war in the Pacific had entered a new phase, and in the hangars of Grumman Aircraft Engineering on Long Island, the lessons of Akutan were coming alive in metal. Sparks flew as welders leaned over the blue-gray skeletons of prototypes, the smell of oil and molten steel thick in the air. To outsiders, it was just another American factory. To those inside, it was something closer to a resurrection. The engineers weren't merely building airplanes. They were building redemption. On drafting tables, under the hum of fluorescent lamps, lay the ghostly fingerprints of the captured Zero, its curves reinterpreted, its flaws rewritten. America's new weapon was taking shape, and it would be called the F6F Hellcat. Roy Grumman, the man behind it all, was an engineer who believed in rugged simplicity. He wasn't romantic about flight. He was a pragmatist. To him, a good fighter wasn't one that could pirouette in the clouds, but one that could bring its pilot home after a dogfight. The Zero had dazzled the world with elegance. Grumman wanted to counter with endurance. "We don't need a ballet dancer," he told his team. "We need a brawler." And so, while Japanese designers chased lightness, the Americans built muscle. The Hellcat was bigger, heavier, and tougher, a steel-clad rebuke to philosophy that had once ruled the skies. Every component of the new fighter was born from the understanding gained at North Island. The Zero could turn sharply but lost control at high speeds. The Hellcat's design to the opposite, built for stability at dive speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. The Zero's light frame disintegrated under heavy fire. The Hellcat could soak up bullets and still keep flying. Engineers added self-sealing fuel tanks, thicker armor plates, and bullet-resistant glass around the cockpit. The wings were strengthened to withstand the punishment of carrier landings. And above all, they mounted the massive Pratt & Whitney R 2800 double Wasp engine, 2,000 horsepower of American vengeance. The sound it made wasn't a hum, but a growl. By the spring of 1943, the first test flights of the Hellcat confirmed what the engineers had hoped. The plane was a beast. It climbed faster than the Wildcat, dove more steadily, and handled like a forgiving teacher rather than a strict examiner. Test pilots described it as docile on the ground, deadly in the air. One of them remarked with a grin, "She's not pretty, but she's on our side." The humor wasn't lost on anyone. After years of fighting a ghost, the U.S. Navy finally had a machine that didn't need miracles to survive a battle. But building a new fighter wasn't just about metal and engines. It was about morale. The Pacific Campaign had cost thousands of lives, and the psychological weight of facing the Zero was immense. American pilots used to enter combat, knowing they were outmatched in speed and maneuverability. They relied on teamwork, luck, and tactics like the thatch weave to stay alive. Now, with the Hellcat, that equation changed. The Navy had a fighter that didn't just level the playing field. It tilted it sharply in America's favor. One pilot described his first encounter with the Hellcat as feeling like the hunted finally had claws. The Hellcat's combat debut came in August 1943, during a raid on Marcus Island. The operation wasn't large, but it was symbolic. The first time the Navy's new fighter would face its old nemesis. As the carriers launched their squadrons into the bright Pacific morning, the deck crews watched those blue-gray silhouettes vanish into the horizon. Above the island, Japanese Zeros rose to intercept, confident as ever. But this time, the fight was different. Pilots reported that when they met head-on, the Hellcat could climb past the Zero, dive away, and come back swinging. One squadron leader radioed, half laughing, "They can't touch us in a dive." Not anymore. That day, the Hellcat announced its arrival to history. From that point forward, the momentum of the air war shifted with startling speed. By mid-1944, the Hellcat dominated every major carrier battle in the Pacific. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the largest carrier-to-carrier engagement in history, it became legend. Japanese pilots called the massacre the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Over 300 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in a single day, most of them Zeros. American losses? Fewer than 30. The numbers sounded exaggerated, almost mythic, but they were real. For every Hellcat loss, 19 enemy planes were shot down. 19 to 1, a statistic that would define the Hellcat forever. But beyond numbers, there are stories, human, vivid, and proud. Lieutenant Alex Vrashu, one of the Navy's top aces, shot down 6 Japanese planes in just 8 minutes during that battle. When he landed, his squadron mates teased him that he'd broken a sweat only because of the sun. "The Hellcat did the hard part," he joked. Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's all-time top ace, recorded 34 aerial victories, 23 of them in a Hellcat. He once described it simply, "It felt like the plane wanted you to win." In those few words, he captured what the engineers in Bethpage had built, not just a machine, but confidence. Grumman's factories earned a nickname among pilots, the Ironworks. It wasn't just because of the materials, but because of the spirit behind them. Pilots joked that you could land a Hellcat on a fence post and still fly it home. Others claimed you could cut one in half, and both pieces would still make it back to the carrier. The humor hid a deeper truth. These planes were forgiving. They didn't demand perfection. They made room for human error, and in war, that mercy was everything. The Zero punished the smallest mistake. The Hellcat allowed you to recover from it. One pilot quipped, "It's like comparing a rapier to a baseball bat, both deadly, but one you can swing after a long night." Behind the laughter was a subtle irony. The Japanese Zero, the most feared aircraft of its time, had unknowingly fathered the weapon that would destroy its legacy. The very machine that once terrorized American skies became the silent teacher for its own defeat. Engineers would later admit that much of the Hellcat's success came from learning through contrast. They didn't copy the Zero's lightness. They corrected it. They didn't mimic its elegance. They outlasted it. The Hellcat was proof that victory doesn't always come from imitation, but from understanding. The difference between the two nations' design philosophies became a reflection of their broader wartime identities. Japan had pursued precision and speed, valuing mastery and discipline. America built in volume and resilience, valuing reliability and forgiveness. The Hellcat embodied an industrial soul, practical, durable, and brutally effective. It wasn't a miracle weapon, just an honest one. As one Navy veteran later said, "The Zero made you a hero. The Hellcat let you live long enough to be one." By late 1944, entire air groups of Hellcats filled carrier decks across the Pacific. Their dark blue wings folded neatly beside one another like the pages of a steel book. They flew over the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, escorting bombers, strafing ships, and dueling with the last of Japan's desperate defenders. The Hellcat's thunderous engine became the soundtrack of America's return to dominance. Photographs from those months show young pilots leaning against the fuselages, grinning, cigarette smoke curling in the salt air. To them, the Hellcat wasn't just a plane. It was proof that their side could learn, adapt, and overcome. There was still danger, of course. Combat never became easy, and the Japanese pilots who faced the Hellcat fought with courage until the end. But the tide was irreversible. Each new engagement brought confirmation that the balance of the skies had shifted for good. In 1945, as the war drew to its violent close, the Hellcat had achieved an almost mythical status among naval aviators. It had destroyed over 5,000 enemy aircraft, more than any other Allied fighter in the Pacific. The Zero, once a symbol of invincibility, had been reduced to an echo of its former glory. After the war, many of the surviving Hellcats were scrapped or mothballed. Their service was over, their purpose fulfilled. But a few were preserved in museums, polished to a mirror shine. Visitors today might see one behind a rope barrier, gleaming under spotlights, and never guess the lineage it carries, that its bloodline traces back to a single crash on a forgotten island. The Akutan Zero, long since dismantled and studied, had given birth to the Hellcat's success story. History has few ironies sharper than that. Looking back, military historians often credit the Hellcat's triumph to American industry, but those who lived it knew it was something deeper. It was curiosity, discipline, and humility, the willingness to learn for the enemy instead of simply hating him. Lieutenant Koga, the Japanese pilot who died on Akutan Island, could never have imagined that his aircraft would teach his adversaries how to defeat his own fleet. And yet, in a strange, poetic sense, that's exactly what happened. His Zero became both a casualty and a catalyst. The plane that lost a war by revealing too much of itself. By 1945, As victory parades filled American streets and the Pacific fell silent, the Hellcat's shadow stretched across history. It had given the U.S. Navy air supremacy and had done so without the fanfare of more famous planes like the Mustang or the Spitfire. The Hellcat didn't seduce with beauty. It earned loyalty through trust. Pilots didn't write poems about it. They just came home because of it. And that, perhaps, was the highest praise. When the last Hellcat rolled off the production line, Roy Grumman reportedly stood quietly beside it, hands in his pockets, saying very little. He didn't see a masterpiece. He saw a machine that had done its job, a student's answer sheet filled out after a long, hard lesson. Somewhere, far away, the wind still whistled over Akutan Island, across the bog where Zero once rested. History had come full circle. The plane that fell had risen again, in a new form, with a new flag, carrying the weight of everything it had once destroyed. If the Pacific War had been a duel in the sky, then the Hellcat was the final, decisive strike, not a weapon of vengeance, but of understanding. And perhaps that is what makes its story timeless. A single crash in 1942 had given birth to the deadliest fighter of the Pacific. The Zero had once ruled the air, but through its own lessons, it unknowingly built a machine that ended its reign. History has a way of recycling its ironies. In the end, the Hellcat's growl was not just a sound of victory. It was the echo of a fallen enemy's gift, roaring back across the ocean that had once divided them.